Before we get started on painting the color wheel, I'd like to remind you of what those hues on the color wheel are meant to represent. And that is color at its full intensity. Like it's right off the rainbow, right off the spectrum. It should be as intense as the color gets, and everything else will be a lowering of intensity. Your color wheel not only represents pure hues, but it also represents, in the center of your wet color wheel, a mixture of hues that are opposite each other on the color wheel. And those opposites are referred to as complements, color complements. We're going to be mixing those color complements, and that's where you get these really beautiful jewel-like subtle tones that exist in nature, rather than these really, really bright, vivid, and perhaps almost overwhelming intensities of color. So I'm going to break apart this color wheel now. These are color aid cards. Fold them up and put them back again. And get back to the color wheel that we're making. I want to show you a little bit about some of the color complements that you will be mixing. One of them is the yellow-violet opposite on the color wheel. This represents color at its most light and color at its darkest. That is, violet is probably the darkest hue. Maybe blue-violet gives it a run for the money. They're all very dark down in this corner of the color wheel. But what happens when you mix those two together? You can see that the color does get subdued, dulled very quickly, but it also produces new color, and those colors are very complex. So some semesters we try to see just exactly how many subtle mixtures we can get. Here's yellow with a little bit of violet in it, with a little more violet in it, and now even with a little more violet in it. Starting with violet, here's violet with a little yellow in it. Violet with a little more yellow in it. And finally, violet with a lot more yellow in it. Look how the nature of the violet seems to change to a new color as the amount of yellow increases and the amount of red and blue decreases. Here, when yellow was mixed with violet, increasingly both red and blue, which make up violet, start to affect the yellowness of the color. Take that set out. Another set of hues that are interesting to make complement mixtures out of are orange and blue. Common complement pair on the color wheel, and I've got orange and blue on this one down here, so I'm just going to put them over here like this. Spread that one over there. And you can see that orange is a relatively light color with a high percentage of yellow and an equally high percentage of red. Right in between, a secondary color. Blue is a primary color, the darkest primary color. And here is an example of what happens to orange when increased amounts of blue is added. There's orange. Excuse me. See if I got these out here. Good. Here's orange with a little blue added. Orange with a little more blue added. And finally, orange with even more blue added. Starting at the blue side, there's blue with a little orange. The blue doesn't seem to be changing very much, maybe getting a little darker looking. Here's blue with a little more orange in it. Still not much is happening to blue. And finally, blue with more orange in it. It's starting to shift darker and darker, apparently, at each step. Now you know how you can get some great browns in your complement and how you can make blue appear darker without making a shade. It gets darker and richer looking when it's mixed with a little bit of orange. Complement pairs and their chromatic neutrals. You also might see little tinges of color along the edges of these where the full intensity color meets the lowered intensity color. You can see strips of blue coming through. That phenomenon is called simultaneous contrast. It's the way your eye and brain work. It can't be controlled, except painters control it by changing how the paint works, where they apply the paint. So that's one complement pair. And then we have another complement pair here, I think. Let's see. Yeah, let's try this. Other popular complement pair would be red. And I'm using the 3 primaries and their complements. And green. Let me dig through my pile to get my green. Okay, green's over on this side of the color wheel. Red's over on this side. And let's find out what happens when green and red are mixed together. So here's red with a little bit of green. Here's red with more green mixed in it. And lastly, here's red with a lot of green mixed in it. You can see that the red is getting darker and darker, and it's also switching towards somewhat of a violet because it's picking up the blue in this color. But it never gets too dark because green contains yellow, and it will continue to stay light as it moves towards a darker color. So here's green with a little bit of red. And some people may just think that's a sort of a dirty green. Here's green with a little more red. And finally, here's green with even more red. They're both very, very dark versions of themselves. And every time you mix these complement pairs, you get some beautiful, beautiful toned down color. You might call it muted up at the top, where you have more of the original hue and less of its complement. But down here, you start to get quite dull color. But it's still luminous in the fact that it is reflecting all wavelengths of light. No white and black has been added. And they're really beautiful, beautiful mixtures.